everyone. Hi from Beirut. My name is Lina Abirafeh. I'm the director of the Institute for Women's Studies in the Arab World that's based at the Lebanese American University here in Beirut, Lebanon. We cover the 22 Arab states and we work at the intersection of academia and activism. We are 45 years old and cover a range of issues talking about Arab women and gender issues in the Arab region, anything from political participation to human rights of migrant domestic workers, to economic empowerment, to youth and leadership and gender-based violence. And today I am talking to you about safe cities, so what this means in the Arab context. So the challenge is, how do we ensure that cities and human settlements are safe for women and girls? And for me, the answer is very simple. You have to actually view them through the lens of women and girls. That's the barometer by which we should gauge whether or not a city is safe. The reality is urbanization is becoming predominant. By 2030, the majority of the world are going to occupy cities, and the Arab region is no exception to that. So this urbanization has brought opportunity, surely, economic opportunity, increased income, independence, mobility, autonomy, but we have to ask ourselves if women and girls are truly benefiting from the opportunities that urban space provides. And if so, which women and girls? Because vulnerable women and girls, women from lower income households, refugee women or displaced women, disabled, minorities, etc., are even farther from benefiting from equality and benefiting from city life overall. Generally, urban women and girls suffer from the same kinds of urban infrastructure problems that you'd imagine: lack of clean water, absence of sanitation facilities, inadequate housing, insufficient living areas, little to no access to public space. When we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, number 11 specifically refers to making cities safe, inclusive, resilient, sustainable. And this can only be done by viewing them, as I've said, through the lens of women. So what we know is if a city is safe for women and for girls, it will be safe for everyone. And ultimately, that's what we all would want. We know that gender equality and women's empowerment are both a standalone goal for these Sustainable Development Goals and intended to be applied across all the other goals. In fact, they're the barometer by which all of our goals and progress towards these goals should be judged. So they're really a prerequisite to achieving every other SDG. So in terms of cities, specifically in Arab spaces, in Arab contexts, urban space is by default male space. And you can see it in the way that men own the streets, how they walk, whether or not they share the sidewalk, how they treat women in that space. Men also make up the majority of those who litter. And this is actually interesting. There have been some studies about this, not just in the Arab region, but overall. The idea that your sense of ownership and entitlement of the public space means that you feel free to do anything you want with it. And when you litter, you render that space less attractive. You are further indicating that you are the sole owner of that space and you can do with it as you please. So even prior to the so-called Arab Spring, urban spaces in Arab cities were stages of feminist protest and feminist regress as well. So both progress and regress took place on Arab streets. Streets here continue to host feminist protests, and they're really the barometer of the country, how the country is doing in terms of human rights and social justice and certainly gender equality. I think that if a woman can walk alone on an urban street in a certain city, it's likely that the rest of the country is safe as well. So that's a barometer for the entire country. I think this is really important. And then we talk about this new field of urban feminism. That's a largely absent field in this region. It's something that we don't talk about. We don't conduct gendered spatial understandings or analyses of Arab cities. These are too few and they need to happen. And also Arab women in decision making in terms of urban planning are unfortunately scant. So without an understanding of the socio-spatial needs of Arab women, the streets are going to continue to be male domain. In public spaces, women also face certain risks: uncomfortable observation, societal criticism, cultural scorn, and certainly sexual harassment. We're unfortunately not immune to that here, although the Me Too movement hasn't taken hold as strongly as it has in other parts of the world, say in the Western world. Women in public space send a message loud and clear that they have lives outside of the home, that they have a right to a life outside of the home. They have a right to circulate in public space, and that they have somewhere to go. Meanwhile, in terms of sexual harassment and increased male occupation of the streets, that also sends another message, and that message is that you don't belong outside of the home. So what we're hearing is these contradictory messages, and without a sense of spatial justice, the freedom to be safe will remain elusive. Safety is a right for women. It is not a privilege. And Arab countries continue to face challenges of insecurity, of conflict, economic restrictions, and this is across the region, and it is played out in the context of cities. Cities are the stage where this takes place. And it's worth understanding what happens to women in public space and to people in public space in general when countries are faced with unemployment, with insecurity, a resurgence of traditional values, an influx of refugees, increased fundamentalisms. These all go hand in hand. And too many Arab societies are unfortunately plagued by these kinds of things. So in other words, pay attention to cities and what's happening, because everything is played out in that space. Now, when it comes to insecurity in cities, that doesn't stem from crime and violence alone, because we need to view insecurity and define insecurity through the lens of women and girls. And that includes social, economic, cultural, domestic, all of those issues. And we need to recognize the risks that women face if cities are not safe. This means paying attention to things like what prevents women and girls from moving around, from circulating freely, from accessing public transportation, from being out on the streets, and providing specific support to those who are doubly vulnerable and marginalized. So put those lenses on and pay attention to what is happening to not only women and girls in general, but specific types of women and girls. So looking at this through an intersectional lens shows that racism and other forms of discrimination are compounding women's risks. Marginalized groups, vulnerable groups, refugees, migrants, ethnic religious minorities, women with disabilities, adolescent girls, elderly women, all of those, they risk being left behind if their specific needs are not taken into account. And racism and other forms of discrimination actually impede women's access to public space and public life. And women and girls with disabilities in particular have a very hard time accessing the basic services that they have a right to access: food, water, sanitation, healthcare, education, transport, information even. So you can imagine how challenging it is and how we have to take those things into consideration if we want to be inclusive. Women and girls living in urban slums also face particular risks. Poverty and overcrowding that brings illness. And women are the primary carers of those who are ill. So if they fall ill themselves, they tend not to have the luxury to stop working. If anybody else falls ill in the family or community, they are responsible to care for them, often at their own expense. Women and girls can therefore be doubly discriminated against because these discriminations actually compound gender discriminations. So now let's move on to violence against women in cities. Violence in cities is more often than not about gender-based violence. And that even the fear of that violence will restrict women's mobilities, will reduce their space, will curb their freedom. So I would argue that even the fear of violence is a form of violence. So violence against women, both in the streets and at home, must be considered a component of urban violence. You can hear the city that I've brought you here. Beirut's streets are notoriously loud, so I can't be with you, but I've brought the honking along just as part of the ambiance. So in any case, cities are not fully functional unless the mobility of women and girls is safe and free from risk or fear. And this kind of violence acts as an obstacle to any kind of development, certainly sustainable development of cities and communities. When women are afraid to access public space, men assume that this is their domain. So they take up that space that women are unable or are afraid to access. And this makes women and girls victims of fear as well as victims of violence. So we need to put comprehensive multi-sectoral services in place that respond to violence against women, that support survivors, because the existence of these services, when they are in place, they even act as a deterrent of violence, because it sends the message that this violence is not acceptable, that people cannot perpetrate with impunity, that there are services and support and hopefully legislation that is on the side of the survivor. So these things are not allowed, not acceptable, not condoned, no. Urban women's safety mechanisms generally are informal and ad hoc. What we lack are the systems and the structures and the services to support women and girls and to make them feel safe in that space. But at the same time, we should look at women's perceptions of their own safety or lack thereof, how they define it and how they understand it, and whether or not they feel that it exists as an early warning system for oncoming crisis. So if women and girls, for instance, do not feel safe, and that has changed, especially in recent months, like the presence of women in public space, women's markets, women out on the streets, that is a sign that something is changing in society, that the society is deteriorating, the community is less safe. So cities should actually be proactive about consulting women and girls to conduct safety audits and map out danger zones, to be able to pinpoint unsafe spaces and identify remedies for these challenges. So this could include better lighting, increased circulation, wider, cleaner streets, amongst a whole range of other measures. So making cities safe for women and girls expands their choices, leads to social, economic, cultural, political, and so on participation as equal citizens with equal access to opportunities and equal presence in public space as is their right. For work, for education, for politics, for recreation. That's an important point as well. Urban conflicts and criminal activity also affect women differently, and they may be deliberately targeted as a way to indirectly harm men from an opposing group, sending a message through women, through women's bodies. That's not unusual, unfortunately, but it definitely is something that has to end. Urban conflicts affect women and girls very, very differently. And so this is something that needs to be taken into account. And the poverty and inequality that already exists among female populations exposes that insecurity and magnifies that vulnerability. It increases isolation for women, weakens their social networks, decreases their mobility, and reduces the possibility they can be safe and access support. Transportation is one area where women's needs and lived realities are not often taken into account. In congested cities like Beirut, as you can hear with all this honking, Cairo, Baghdad, public transportation is also male domain, and women do not take it, or not as often as they should, and definitely far less so than men do. Every aspect of public transportation in Arab cities needs to take into account safety, routing, sanitation, the platform safety, the station, the lighting, and make special considerations for women traveling alone, women traveling at night also. Being able to travel safely brings increased access to economic opportunities. So you see there are benefits, and when you miss out on some of these things, it's like dominoes, everything falls. So safe transportation is a means to an end, as well as an end in itself. And when you talk about mobility and what that means, it must be broadly defined and examined through a rights-based framework in terms of women's right to the city and to move around in that city, and how then we will see that those cities are invariably falling short for women. And then if you look at a situation of crisis or an emergency, a humanitarian emergency, these challenges are magnified. Look at Yemen, look at Iraq, look at Palestine, look at Syria in this region. Women face even greater risk in urban spaces. They're increasingly vulnerable and their insecurities are magnified. In an emergency, safe cities and safe settlements become harder to come by, and the need for them is even greater. So we look at these protracted crises where emergency becomes a permanent state and temporary settlements become permanent settlements. So there is never a time to do this after the emergency is over. Usually these emergencies keep recurring and continue to be played out in cities, but the functions of a city itself do not cease. They just become more constrained and more challenging. People are already mobile, they're already circulating, but just not in particularly safe ways. And again, women and girls. So emergencies aren't the time to ignore urban space. It is the time to ensure that it is better. So what about building Arab
feminist cities. Is that even possible? There's a growing movement of feminist urbanism, a movement to make cities safer and more inclusive, more diverse, better for women and girls. This is not yet taken hold in the region. We hope that it does. We're seeing it play out in other parts of the world, and we hope to learn from that. And that's where women play a key role in urban planning and in urban design. And this is built on the principle of women's rights to the city. And urban planning is never gender neutral. In a city like Beirut, where we don't have a lot of urban planning at all, doesn't take anyone into account, but nonetheless, Arab cities have to look to the future and to all of their occupants equally, taking them all into account. This means ensuring lighting, pedestrian access, signage, well-maintained public spaces, amenities, bathrooms, provisions for nursing mothers. All of that needs to be taken into account, and if it's not raised specifically and deliberately, then it is forgotten. In the Arab region, government and decision-making structures are inaccessible to much of the population and therefore less accessible to women, and certainly inaccessible to girls. Most of the architects, the planners, the policymakers, urban designers are still men. That is changing, but it's changing slowly. So we would do well to encourage young people, young women, to enter into these fields and to support them to design these modern spaces that are going to be inclusive and represent their interests, rather than reinforcing what is the patriarchal status quo in public space. So we should measure women's rights in urban environments using a scoring system, a system that is invariably created by women themselves and to be completed by women. So they're the ones that are measuring legal frameworks, women's engagement in urban planning, gendered perspectives in transport and housing and recreational and public space and so on. Look at public statues. Even public statues must depict women, and very often our bronze brethren are mostly men. And that sends the message as well that the streets aren't for women, that women aren't celebrated on those streets. So as a young girl who grows up seeing statues of only men, what does that tell her? On the other hand, young people, both male and female, who grow up seeing statues of both women and men will know that the city is theirs, for everyone, where everyone is honored, protected, and respected. So these spatial understandings have to meet the needs of women and girls. And that concept of shared space has to start at a very young age, start at in the sandbox. So girls and boys who are raised with this a sense of equal right to public space will grow into adults who never ever bring that right into question. They will grow up understanding and assuming that everybody has equal access to that space. Spatial evolutions and revolutions can bring social revolutions, and that's what we're after. So we think that Arab cities can do better to engage the full range of actors with women's organizations, with feminist groups that are firmly in the lead. So when we talk about inclusive design, what we mean is evaluating the gendered impact of work before it's launched and ensuring that it caters to the needs of all of its population, everyone. In a safe city, everyone's rights are respected and protected. Everyone enjoys equal access to public space and public life without fear. And everyone is involved in the decision-making about public space. In short, it's obvious that everyone benefits because a city that is safe for women is safe for everyone. Thank you very much.